Assalamu alaikum, my name is Aisha Humaira, and in this video I'll be describing the mechanism of speech production. When it comes to speech production, there are three important mechanisms that are needed to produce speech. These are respiration, phonation, and articulation. However, in this video, I will mainly focus on articulation. However, let's briefly describe respiration and phonation. Speech is first produced by the pushing of air out from the lungs into the trachea and then to the larynx. The air from the lungs provides the energy source needed to produce the speech. It is important to note the fact that when we are producing speech sounds, it is during the act of exhalation instead of inhalation. So after the airstream has passed from the lungs into the trachea and then reaches the larynx, it then reaches the vocal cords, which are two small folds of elastic muscular tissues enclosed within the thyroid cartilage. These vocal folds will vibrate once the airstream passes through it to produce voiced consonants. However, other sounds like voiceless consonants do not involve vibration of the vocal folds. Our vocal folds are the ones that produce our voice. Once phonation has taken place, the air then passes to the pharynx and then to the oral or nasal cavities or both, where they will be modified by the movement of the articulators. Hence, articulation takes place. These are some examples of articulators. These articulators move to shape the resonant cavities of the vocal tract, so they will alter the resonances, which will give the acoustic output that we call as speech. In this video, I'll be talking only about three of them briefly. The mandible is an extremely important articulator in its supportive role of carrying the lips, tongue, and teeth to their targets in the maxilla. For speech, the mandibular elevators and depressors stay in the dynamic balance so that a slight modification in muscle activation and inhibition by antagonist permits a quick adjustment of the mandible. These are some additional structures that are also involved in the movement of the mandible. In the temporomandibular joint, there are also sensors of joint position, which will allow extremely accurate positioning of the jaw. Now let's talk about the lowering and the raising of the velum. Oral sounds involve air passing through only the oral cavity, so in this case the velum is raised to block the passage in the nasal cavity. However, for nasal sounds, it involves air passing through both the oral and nasal cavity, so the velum is lowered to allow the passage. The velum is generally closed for non-nasal speech, and this is the result of contraction of the levator veli palatini, which is a direct antagonist to the palatoglossal muscle. In speech, the opening and closing of the velar port must occur precisely and rapidly, or the result will be hyper or hyponasality. When producing high-pressure consonants such as fricatives and stops, these consonants usually require greater velopharyngeal effort, which is aided by the additional help from the superior pharyngeal constrictor as well as the uvular muscles. Now let's look at another articulator, which is arguably one of the most, if not the most important of the articulators. It is involved in the production of the majority of phonemes in English. The extrinsic muscles set the basic posture of the tongue, whereas the intrinsic muscles have a great deal of responsibility for the microstructure of articulation. The two groups of muscles work closely together to achieve the target articulatory motion. So, all of the articulators that I have mentioned before and many more are responsible for the articulation of speech sounds. Speech is one of the most complex sequential motor tasks performed by humans, and it is said that the articulation of speech sounds relies on the feedback system to monitor errors in producing the target phonemes. The DIVA model assumes that the speech targets are regions in the auditory space and combines two control mechanisms to reach those targets, the feedback control system as well as the feed-forward control system. The feedback mechanism generates corrective motor commands when the actual speech sound deviates from the intended speech sound. Now, when it comes to the feedback mechanism, it may take the form of auditory information, for example, hearing your own production to determine how accurate your attempt at speech was, tactile and kinesthetic feedback, which is perceiving how accurately your physical target was achieved in articulation, or even feedback from external sources, for example, the frown on someone's face when he or she does not understand what you have said. The The feed-forward mechanism generates predictive motor commands based on past experiences with the speech target. Now, I'm going to be explaining and elaborating on these two mechanisms. First, let us start with what actually happens first when we are trying to produce speech. First off, the initial input comes from the auditory model. For example, the phoneme E is a targeted sound that the articulatory system attempts to replicate. This phoneme activates a sound map cell, which is some sort of image, in the premotor cortex and is sent to the auditory and somatosensory regions responsible for monitoring the accuracy of speech. This means that, let's say that we plan to say something which involves the phoneme E. The phoneme E, which is our target sound, will then activate an image in the premotor cortex. So the premotor cortex is responsible for planning, and we plan to say E. So once this image is activated in the premotor cortex, the information is then sent to the auditory as well as the somatosensory regions, which are the regions responsible for monitoring our speech production. Once this image is sent to these two regions, it is important to remember that these regions don't just receive information from the premotor cortex, but it also receives input from the auditory system as well as the tactile and the kinesthetic information related to the state of the articulators at that particular moment. So by receiving information or input from these different regions, if the motor command results in an acoustic output that is distorted from the ideal target sound planned by the premotor cortex, the auditory error map will compare the ideal that the premotor region desired with the reality that the motor system produced and cause a change in the articulatory velocity and position maps. So, for example, we want to say the phoneme E, but let's say that what we produced instead is oo. So the output that we have produced is completely different from what the premotor region desired. In the case that this happens, the auditory error map will notice that there is a difference in the output and the desired. So this will result in a change in the articulatory velocity and position maps. In other words, the muscles will then be activated in a different way on the next trial so that the next acoustic output will be closer to the ideal target. So once the target is accurately learned, the feedback system takes the back burner to the feed-forward system. That is to say, we no longer use the output of the feedback system to correct our speech continually, but rather we count on our learned accuracy to carry us through the task of talking. We do not stop monitoring our speech, and if we do have some perturbing event such as oral anesthesia, we can then return to the feedback system to help us correct the errors. Note that when you do have anesthesia, your speech is necessarily a bit slower as you try to speak clearly. This is because you are relying on the feedback system, which is slow. Feedback system is usually a mechanism used by people who are still in their motor development stage. So for speakers like us who are experienced in engaging in conversations and producing speech sounds, it is usually the case that we are using the feed-forward system to produce the speech rather than the feedback system. This is because we no longer need to constantly monitor our acoustic output as much as we used to do when we were little, when we were still developing our ability to produce speech sounds.